All right. Welcome, everybody. I am thrilled to have you here today, and I'm thrilled about the topic that we're talking about. So first of all, let me stop and introduce myself. For those that don't know me, I'm Bob Clements. I'm the president of Axiom Group. I've been with Axiom for 12 years. I've been in the workforce management space for most of my career. And what I'm excited to talk to you about today is that I think we finally have a problem for labor budgeting. Labor budgeting is one of those challenging things that everybody struggles with. And we're going to talk about some of those struggles today. You're going to hear from some industry experts about the struggles that they have with labor budgeting. We're going to ask you about your challenges with labor budgeting. But ultimately, why I'm so excited is I'm excited to talk to you about our labor budgeting solution, Planara. Now, Planara has literally been years in the making. It kind of was built on top of the success that we had with Opus, our work measurement solution. Once we launched that, we realized how much of a need there was for a really easy to use, comprehensive labor budgeting solution. And we think that we've delivered that in Planara. So to talk about Planara and talk about labor budgeting, I've asked a couple of colleagues to join me today. And the first colleague I'd like to bring into this conversation is David Roberts. David, do you want to take a minute and introduce yourself to the rest of the group?
Yeah, good afternoon. As you can probably tell, I'm in the UK. I work as the commercial director in EMEA, and I've worked in our industry for about 20 years. And I have to say, budgeting has always been a really live issue and a really difficult issue for many of my customers. And it's funny because everybody appears to have a pretty unsatisfactory method, and everybody seems to have a pretty unsatisfactory answer. So I caught up with some of my industry colleagues the other day, and this is what they had to say about some of the challenges that they're facing.
From a labour budgeting process perspective, I've been involved now for probably 13, 14 years. I've certainly seen a good few budget cycles in my time.
I've worked in labour budgeting for over 5 years, initially starting out looking at efficiencies in stores, and then subsequently how we materialise them more effectively.
The budgeting process should be a real positive. It should be something that the business embraces. It should be an opportunity to get the right amount of resource into sites to allow them to deliver the business objectives. But I think so often it feels far from being a positive experience and more like going into battle.
Is the manual nature of it. So when looking at multiple scenarios across numerous different spreadsheets, it can often be really complex. Data can be misaligned, and therefore it can involve a lot of heavy lifting across a number of people.
I see kind of huge kind of multi-million pound budgets being calculated and worked through on Excel spreadsheets, which were never designed for that kind of purpose, and they're just simply not agile enough and not robust enough to give us the agility that I think the business very often looks to us to provide.
There are many layers of decisions that either need to be made or factored in, and then any subsequent changes off the back of those are typically manual on spreadsheets, and therefore are really time consuming and involve a lot of people.
It can start to be seen as a little bit of a dark art, and I've certainly experienced kind of challenge from the organisation around how robust our processes are, why don't things add up, why aren't the numbers kind of quite as we expected, and that kind of reputational challenge then carries right through the rest of the year, and it can be something that's really hard to recover from. Ultimately, as time ticks on through the process, both sides start to get more and more anxious and more challenging of each other, and what actually ends up happening is we reach a compromise that probably neither side is particularly happy with, but the kind of time pressures and the business needs dictate that we have to get somewhere.
3 things I'd like to improve about budgeting. The first 2 would be transparency and simplicity, so that all our stakeholders understand the process, so that there's a greater trust in the output. And the third is agility. So when there's lots of change, the capability to review multiple scenarios would improve that speed of decision making.
And for me, having a solution, a properly designed piece of software that can pull all of those component parts of a budgeting process together, that eliminates that kind of risk of formulas being copied over or things being pasted in the wrong place, but also gives us the speed and the agility to run multiple iterations and kind of present those in a very compelling and clear way is definitely a big win for me, and I think would be a huge move on in any budgeting process in any organization.
Wow. I think that the stories that we heard from Andy and Adam were probably things that we're all familiar with, right? Certainly I've heard that from retailers that we worked with around the world. And I love how Andy describes the budgeting process as a bit of a dark art, because it can be very, very opaque. And Adam talked about, how he would like to see transparency in that process to allow for kind of better buy-in and better agility with the overall organization. So I think we heard a number of challenges from our industry experts, but I'm curious to know what our audience's challenges are. What are the most difficult parts of the budgeting process for you guys? And to capture that, we have a live poll going on right now with Poll Anywhere. So if you could scan that QR code, or if you could go to the URL, that's at the top of the page there. It'll ask you for your name, but you can click skip if you want to, and then you can start ranking these things. Now, to rank them is really pretty easy, although maybe not super intuitive. What you do is you click on the particular answer, and then you can use the arrows to move things up and down. So put the most difficult thing at the top and the least difficult thing at the bottom. And we've got a few options for you. So for example, do you find that building an accurate long range volume forecast is the most difficult thing, or maybe it's generating activity-based workload projections?
Or you might find that integrating your workforce management assumptions like staffing rules are your most challenging aspect, or even looking at things like seasonality and the periodic nature of workload.
Yeah, it could be something like aligning financial and operational planning metrics or allocating labor budgets down to that store level. I think spreading data can be really challenging across locations.
Or finally, the conundrum about how do you manage the whole process across the whole organization, multiple teams, multiple locations, and multiple times a year. There's a whole load in there, isn't there, Bob? Let's be honest about it.
Well,
any one of those could be the top, really.
Exactly. And it's funny watching these live results come in, how we're seeing a couple kind of battle around the top, right? So, the first one that jumps out at me is generating that activity-based workload projection, right? Really doing that bottom-up build, which is, it requires a lot of data. It requires a lot of time. It requires coordinating across the organization. And because it requires so much, it's hard to be really nimble with those bottom-up workload projections.
And are you finding in the States that the workload projections are changing based upon customer buying habits? They're completely different from like pre-pandemic.
Oh yeah, I mean, certainly the omni-channel has changed the way that labor is being deployed in the store, and because it's created new jobs and new tasks and new focus areas. And I think as we move past the pandemic, we're seeing things reset again. It's not that omni is going away, but it's the balance is changing, and then that changes the labor that we need in the stores depending on the purpose of the store, really.
That's it. Number two, the financial and operational planning metrics are becoming a firm favourite, and I think that's a really difficult one as well, isn't it? Making sure you've got the right cost profile, particularly with the pay rises and the cost rises we're seeing across retail. That's certainly a huge challenge for a number of my customers.
Yeah, no doubt. And then the third of the top three is managing the process across multiple tools and teams, right? I think that everybody's got their own spreadsheet. Everybody's got their own way to represent the budget. How do you get one version of the truth? I think that's something that we really see organizations struggle with around the world. So David, maybe you want to tell us a little bit about what we're doing to solve this problem, and what else is available out there right now?
Well, that's a really interesting question, because there is one product that is used pretty ubiquitously across the market, and it's called Excel. But I think as we've been hearing, it has its challenges, right? It gets corrupted, it falls over. You've got to keep multiple iterations of it, and it's really quite difficult. So I don't think there's really a solution as such. I mean, we've certainly seen products that do financial planning for products and for distribution of products. That works pretty well. But no, candidly, there really isn't much out there by way of workforce management or labor planning for a budgeting tool.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that, what we've seen is some financial tools. The one that comes to my mind is Anaplan, which is a great financial budgeting solution, but it's not built for purpose for labor and doesn't really allow for the bottoms up build that we often need and people say is one of their biggest challenges here. I also think that the WFM vendors have each kind of offered some flavor of budgeting, but what it basically becomes is a tool to restrict the forecast to what the budget is to make sure we're coming in under budget, as opposed to being a robust tool to do planning and what if analysis and things like that.
So I think that sounds a really good point, at which we should introduce people to Planara.
Building and managing your labor budget is one of the most complicated processes you're responsible for. It requires collaboration and alignment between departments, precise reporting on exactly how your budget is being allocated, and you need to be confident that the decisions you're making are informed and data-driven. Introducing Planara, powered by Axiom. Planara is the integrated labor planning and analytics solution that is built for operations. Planara is the perfect solution for improving alignment between finance and operations as you accelerate your labor budgeting processes. With Planara, both finance and ops can see how and why labor budget is being generated. For finance, this means assessing labor in terms of top-down metrics, like sales per labor hour, rate of sales, and labor budgets in local or global currencies. Meanwhile, operations can be confident that labor is being generated the right way, using labor standards, demand drivers, location characteristics, and other key business rules, providing your locations with the right amount of labor. The result? A labor budget that both finance and operations can understand, defend, and have confidence in achieving. But building your budget is only part of what makes Planara so powerful. Planara also gives you powerful reporting and analytics tools, giving you the ability to adapt to shifting performance metrics and achieve your operational goals. Planara gives you unparalleled visibility into how labor is being allocated through each fiscal period, between your locations, among roles and employee types, and across individual activities and tasks. Planara can also help you evaluate the labor impact of new initiatives or changes to your operating model. What if we opened 10 new locations? What if we increased wages by 5%? What if customer demand rose by 8%? These are just some of the what-if scenarios that Planara can help you evaluate. Best of all, Planara integrates seamlessly with both your WFM solution and your labor model, whether it's housed in Opus or any other labor model management solution. Planara creates one environment, a single source of truth for all your labor planning and analytics needs. Welcome to Planara, the solution for enabling alignment between finance and ops, while you accelerate your labor planning processes. To learn more about Planara, visit us online at axiomgroup.com/Planara today.
Well, that is pretty cool, I have to admit. I love that video. And the reality is it's been up for a little bit of time. I think people have seen it, or I hope people have seen it. But I want to now get an opportunity to show you guys some live software. So to do that, I'd like to bring Luke Mueller-Liley into the conversation. Luke, do you want to take a minute and introduce yourself to the audience?
Yeah, thanks, Bob, and hello, everyone. I'm product manager at Axiom. So that includes Planara, as well as the other solutions Bob mentioned, Opus, our labor modeling platform, and Studia, our data collection tool for time studies. Fun fact about me is that I'm a labor planning geek like many of you. I've been involved in labor planning one way or another throughout my entire career, starting in retail finance, then over to store operations, then from a workforce management perspective, and now for the last 4 years, heading up our productivity practice at Axiom. But today, I'm really excited to be able to share and demonstrate our Planara solutions. So, with that, let's go ahead and get started. So welcome to Planara. You're looking at our home screen. It's a dashboard of all the scenarios I've configured for actually the next fiscal year already. And really Planara with it, everything starts and ends with the scenario, and that's what we see here. There's all kinds of different categories you could configure for your specific planning needs. I have what if scenarios over on the upper right. I have longer range and period plans in the middle. And then I have more near-term forecasts from the WFM system or actual or earned performance. So I can dig into, for example, the last 12 months of performance that I prepared here and drill
Hey,
into.
Luke, just real quick before we go down into that, when we're looking at each of those different scenarios at the top, really, I think one of the other things that's interesting is you kind of have different versions of them up there, right? So actuals and trailing 12 months, different versions of the budgets, et cetera, right?
Exactly, yeah. So these are sort of verticals or categories of scenarios you can, again, configure specifically for your needs. I happen to kind of set up a range here for our demo purposes. But then as you pointed out, Bob, I'm bringing in actuals. I don't yet have a full year of actuals for, or any actuals rather, for fiscal 23. So that's why I configured this scenario to pull in the last 12 periods essentially of data, so I can use that as a reference point for any budget or any what if that I might configure for the upcoming year.
Yeah, so it gives us a really good starting point for that budgeting process. So you were starting to show us how we could look at some of that data. Why don't you do that?
Yeah, it's a good point. I might also mention that these are the 12 trailing 12 periods. Doesn't stop me from potentially creating another actual scenario that talks about promotional mapping, where I might map Easter holidays or different shifts from one week to the other year over year. So there's a lot of different flavors of even actual performance I can view here year over year. Cool. But I was just going to show you some of the power just right at your fingertips with your key KPIs. So I can drill in or highlight our North American region, see their performance versus the others. I could kind of maybe focus in on the expense rate performance. North America is performing pretty well. Let's if we drill into this a little bit further, we can see the results by the various locations. Maybe start investigating what Houston's doing that some of the other cities could learn from in terms of managing their expense rate. But
or are they spending on labor?
Yeah, that could be as well. We might want to invest in their labor potentially. So we'll look at some of their top line performance and see if that balances out. I could keep going, but I know today we're going to focus on everyone's favorite process, the annual budget, and so and really showcase how Planara can help you optimize the process, but maybe more importantly, help you focus on optimizing the expense itself. And typically that's your number one expense line item, the store labor cost.
Yeah, well, and I could hear the air quotes around your phrase, everyone's favorite process, right? It's like the necessary evil is really important, but as we've been talking about, it's really, really challenging to do and do well. So most organizations, the budgeting process for them, or most operations teams, the budgeting process for them starts when they build that initial draft of the budget, whether that's bottoms up or however they're producing it. But that becomes the baseline. That becomes the starting point for future iterations based on input from others. How does that process work in Planara?
Yeah, Bob, we've purposefully designed Planara to be adaptable to those changing operational realities. So a baseline 1 minute might change with more near-term, recent performance or new initiatives you just rolled out. So we need that initial step to be really flexible and to be able to evolve even through your budget cycle. So let's walk through an initial baseline budget I configured and kind of take you through the workflow to set these up. And it's 5 simple steps. The first is just defining a few details, give it a name and a description. These are those categories I configured. Again, those can be whatever your particular company's needs are. Have it in the proper budget category. We have the different fiscal calendar setup pre-configured in the solution. So this company happens to be on the 4-5-4 pattern with a fiscal year start in February, like a retail calendar typically does. And
hey, I'm sorry to interrupt you there, Luke, but on the calendar side, you've got for the different kind of fiscal calendar set up, but what if I have a unique calendar? Can I create my own?
You can, absolutely. So you can create that, and you can manage fiscal years in terms of, 52 week or 53 week year. That's all out of the box functionality. In terms of duration, we can keep our focus on a single fiscal year, like a budget would be, or we can have longer range plans or ongoing plans in the form of what we call a forever scenario that can span, multiple years. We'll keep our focus on the upcoming year. And then, as Bob mentioned, our baseline is really an attempt to see an apples to apples projection of our current, labor demand needs, our current operational model. And so we have what's called a metric template, which we've configured to produce the bottom up or activity based labor out of the box. And so we'll keep that selected, but more on metric templates coming up, I suspect.
So just to make sure I understand what you're saying, or make sure our audience understands what you're saying, if you have a rich labor model, this is actually pulling in those activity-based labor standards and then using that to build your bottom-up budget, or at least the baseline in this case. I mean, that's really, really powerful.
That's right, Bob. And I'll even skip ahead a step. The labor model section here is where you get to define, which standards, which, in this case, departments, jobs, or tasks I want to, focus on. We're creating a chain-wide, baseline. So we're gonna cover all 4 departments I've configured. But for what ifs or other, types of scenarios, I might segment jobs or tasks and look specifically at those. In terms of the labor model, Planara seamlessly integrates the most up-to-date, effective dated labor standards and other configurations from our Opus platform. Those configurations can also be imported from a third-party tool or homegrown tool. And you can configure labor standards directly in Planara, particularly if you want to take a higher level look at labor. So as I mentioned, we want to look at an apples to apples view of what's live today, what's in production in your WFM environment. So I've just taken my production standards here, no other filters at this point in time. And speaking of WFM, I also want to layer in my staffing levels, and that's our term for your min-max coverage rules. So I have a template configured for the specific WFM min-max rules that are configured. I could alternate and maybe look at some other options for different scenarios, but I'm going to keep it right now at my default level. And then finally, we have a new feature called Flex Rules, and I could go on and on about those. My colleague actually just wrote a blog about this feature and some other cool things this week, so I encourage you to check those out. But needless to say, they help increase the accuracy, the precision of how raw labor, your labor model hours, can flex up or down to meet or be constrained potentially by your min-max rules. Now, I skipped ahead, so let's go back to the organization. And this is effectively where I choose the scope of the scenario in terms of the locations I want to include, right? And this leverages the effective dated hierarchy that I've brought in from, in this case, the WFM system directly. I could import it from another source if desired. And I said effective dating, so I can view this hierarchy along any time frame. It's defaulting to today, but I can go back earlier, beginning or end of time as we configure that, and see what the hierarchy looks like as of that point in time. It's pretty powerful. As we've kind of seen, we're a multinational corporation here, and so I can potentially segment my baseline or my budgets in general by region or by division or brand. I can drill in and maybe run a plan just for a specific location, or maybe take out locations as needed. Today, I will keep our focus on the entire chain, but while we're here, I'll just point out that given that we're multinational, we do have a number of different currencies, and you can see here that I've assigned unique currency for the United Kingdom stores, and all the locations below that inherit that assignment. So we'll stick with the total company, and then we'll skip over to financials. And this part's extremely simple, right? We need to set an exchange rate and a wage rate template, average hourly rate essentially. And we're pretty early on in the process, so finance may or may not have this ready to go for the upcoming year. And so we in this case we do have a budgeted rates imported or configured in the system. But if we needed to, we could pick our actual up-to-date performance or maybe a projection for the remainder of this year and carry that forward. So a lot of flexibility to update these assumptions as they mature over the course of the budgeting season. And then last but not least are the metrics. And that's our term for all the volume and labor and other KPIs that go into creating a budget. So metrics kind of correlate or go along with, it's not loading, so let's see if that,
it's a
that
demo.
changes here. It's a demo, there's always gonna be something. There we go.
There we go.
So I've pre-configured a couple options, and these are quite flexible in nature. So at one point in time, you may have certain data ready to go, and maybe next month we have obviously another period of actuals to reference at a minimum. So the first source I'll reference for sure is our most recent actual performance. Again, I said we're in July and we started the year in February, so we have 5 full periods of performance. So I have that brought in from fiscal 23 from our actual category. Now I have a choice. I could take the last 7 periods of last year, as you can see here in the second option, from fiscal 21, mapping that over to this year. But as I think Bob mentioned, the performance is changing on a dime these days, and that's already quite out of date. So I've fortunately loaded my most recent financial forecast from the last period into the system. And if I go ahead and select that source, I now have the remainder of this fiscal year, fiscal 22, available to project forward. So the combination of these two sources can be loaded. This can be further segmented by different areas or with new and immature stores, adding historical data as well. So I would go ahead and load sources, and just like that, I'm ready to run the scenario. So in a matter of minutes, I've built my baseline for this first iteration. I've actually already run the scenario.
Hey, Luke, before you
Yeah.
do that, when you say run the scenario, what you really mean is taking all of that data, all of that configuration, and building that bottom-up scenario that we started out to begin with. I think what's nice about the way that Planara works is it doesn't lock up your computer while it's doing that calculation. It comes up into the cloud and our environment processes all that information in the background and then spits out the result for you to look at later on. We're crunching a tremendous amount of data here. So, it may take, a half hour, an hour to run the budget. And then when you come back, it'll be available there for you. So if you want to keep working in the system or do something else, you can. So you were just saying, Luke, though, you pre-ran this for us. So show us what this looks like.
Exactly, Bob. And the way I know that I have a clue is it's an active scenario, and that automatically that status changes from new to active when I have results ready to view. So if I click over to our results tab, I have a lot of different ways to slice and dice the data. First off, I can look at all our summary metrics and drill in to our organization, number of different countries. I can go from the country level, drill into specific locations and so forth. Now, beyond that, I can get below the location level, and this report allows me to start at a department and drill into the next level, which is the job level. So now I have a comprehensive view of my key KPIs for those areas. And if that's not enough for you, we have the detailed level. So that activity-based level that we're focused on. So I have task here out of the box, and then if I expand to the next level, I now have my budget results by labor standard all the way down to that. I can highlight certain areas I want to maybe focus on, like cashiering, for example. I can actually select a few at a time and see my overall cashiering spend and kind of the fixed versus variable breakdown. I could, like I showed you earlier, kind of focus on a single view. And this view, I can actually go ahead and export this out to Excel if I want to do some further analysis. So I could clearly spend all day doing this and have, but I suspect, like all of your colleagues in finance, my colleagues on the call here probably have another scenario to send my way.
That is really impressive. So just to clarify, this is just like version 1 of the budget, right? This is the first kind of cut that we've got to here, Luke.
That's right, David.
So if I put my finance hat on, I would like to think that you could do some more sort of modeling relatively easily, but that is, in my experience, where it gets really quite difficult. So things like maybe you want to change the way you're assuming around conversion, maybe you're going to change the average transaction value, but those kind of factors, maybe you want to keep some of them constant while the other change. They're the kind of scenarios that I've come across. You mentioned it before, being an international business, we come across a lot of foreign exchange. We may want to look at different assumptions around that, and make all of these financial updates. So ideally, realistically, how easily can you now change this baseline with these new kind of financial metrics?
Yeah, those are some great examples, David. I think you might have missed your calling as a financial analyst, perhaps.
I think my colleagues would disagree with you there, but thank you nonetheless.
But yeah, clearly it's not just a matter of, from a finance perspective, layering in sales and see what happens, right? There's so much more to control or potentially tweak from those top-down assumptions. Let's take them in reverse order. So you mentioned exchange rates, currency conversions. You see here in the report, I can quickly toggle between global and local values. Actually, we got an enhancement coming where you'll actually see those individual currency symbols next to the results, depending on the assignment that you saw earlier. So that's readily available right out of the box with those exchange rate templates we assigned. Now, in terms of proactively and sometimes reactively managing those assumptions that come down from finance, that's where the metric template idea comes into play. So I'll just quickly show you a few of those. And again, these are all configurable to your specific planning needs. When we implement, we'll probably have a few that you use today, but really the sky's the limit in terms of how you want to manage those relationships between your volume and labor metrics. Was there a question?
No,
Okay.
Not from me, Luke, no.
Okay. So as I mentioned earlier, we have the bottom-up template assigned, and that's generating that detailed activity-based model from your granular drivers. But if we want to, target or anchor around sales or other metrics, we have this top-down template to take advantage of. So finance could provide sales, conversion, other rates, and that can back into your detailed drivers, and then still generate your bottom-up activity-based labor from that. And then if you want to manage labor or have a comparison from a truly top-down perspective, where you're targeting a labor hours or cost value from the start, you can set up a number of different templates. One is a sales per labor hour view, where if finance provides a sales per labor hour target, it will back into the hours based on your sales volumes. Or if you want to take it even up a further, you have the expense rate template, where you can start from a targeted expense rate and wage rate and sales and back into both your costs and your hours based on those relationships. So this is an example of what's possible, but there's plenty more you could, again, do proactively as part of your routine process, as well as maybe differently as part of what-if scenarios. So we know we're going to move forward with updating some results from finance as a next step from our baseline. So there's a couple options for doing that. The first is looking at importing a simple file with sales per store per week, for example. And you can do that quite easily through our import utility. from a local file or from an SFTP site. So that's the most direct approach, and where you can get the most granular. But we're pretty early on in the process here. We have several months to go before the end of the year, and so finance may not have all those projections ready to go. So I've gone ahead and created a second iteration called our top-down budget. And you'll see I assigned the metric template top-down. So that means I can take advantage of those external imports, or I could make adjustments directly in the system. So what I'm going to do is click on the adjustment tab, and I believe I have, yeah, there they are. I have some metrics adjustments pre-configured. So I have, first of all, assumed a pretty lofty sales growth assumption for next year. We know a lot of that's fueled by, unfortunately, inflationary pressure. So in order to manage how much of that growth is truly, customer based versus, average unit retail based, I've added an additional adjustment for the transactions driver. So by growing that at 2%, now I can assume safely that about 2/3 of the growth year over year is going to be fueled by inflation versus customer traffic. So once these are configured, I can go ahead and once again run the scenario. I've done that in the interest of time, and we have some results to share. Now, this time, because you asked about comparisons, instead of just looking at this scenario in an isolated fashion, I'm going to pull up our scenario comparison report. And what that allows me to do is pick 2 or more scenarios and look at them side by side. So I have my baseline budget, and then I have my top-down budget, the one I just created. And just like that, I can compare them side by side. So I can, once again, expand down and compare results by region. I can once again go to the detailed level, compare them side by side by labor standard or task. I can drill into the raw hours metric and see actually that sales increase did have a pretty significant jump. And once again, I can export this value out of the system and do some further analysis. So yeah, I think really in terms of iterations, the sky's the limit here in terms of incorporating those financial assumptions.
That's awesome. I love that scenario comparison. I think that the graphical view of that is just absolutely tremendous. So we've created a baseline budget. We've created some variations of that budget. But how do we kind of bring everything together and ultimately put it into real world use? How do we make it? How do we get it into our WFM system or wherever else we may want to take it in the future?
Yeah, when I think about real world, I think, okay, it's nice to project an apples to apples view. It's nice to layer in your financials, but the real power of the budget season, and hopefully more and more throughout the year with a tool like Planara, is to take all these pivots or these what ifs, and hopefully when you've approved a new process or you have a new assumption to take on, then basically fold that back into your budget, your most active plan. So to showcase that, I put together a couple examples of what if scenarios, both of which I just took a copy of the most recent budget and changed a few assumptions. So the first is a scenario looking at the omnichannel business, and the team there has introduced a new picking application to really help with your in-store fulfillment, hopefully cut down some of the time to put together customer orders. So for that, I really wanted to isolate the specific job for that activity. So that's our online job in this configuration. And now instead of just looking at my production standards, I can look at the what if standards as well. And I've already created a group, basically a cross section of standards that correspond to what this change would unfold. So with just a few selections here, I can go off and run a scenario isolating those changes and comparing it to the baseline. Now, I could have, if if time was of the essence and I didn't have the chance to, study this or model it in a work measurement tool like Opus, I could make some quick and dirty adjustments as well. If I go into standards, for example, here, I have all my standards and I could filter on the ones I want to adjust and add a relative adjustment to those as a placeholder. So you have a lot of opportunity to do the kind of quick and dirty analysis. And in this case, I've done my diligence and I'm ready to fold that process into the scenarios going forward. Now, the other what if I put together was around different regional wage rate growth assumptions. So we have a factor already configured. Oh, there we go. There we are. With wage rates, we already assumed a 2.75% global average hourly rate a growth assumption for the whole fiscal year. But we know that we're seeing higher wage inflation in the China market, and so we've layered on an additional 2% to account for that. And so that scenario is already run as well. So my final step is we're ready to account for those in the latest budget scenario, and I got to find it. So one way to help me find it is I can filter by budget, and I have our fourth iteration kind of pre-built. And there's really two ways of pulling together information from different scenarios, right? One is mimicking the same configuration. So if I go to the adjustment tab and I go to wage rates, I see I have that same configuration there that I could have copied over or just reconfigured quickly here. And that provides that adjustment directly. But when in the case of the omnichannel example, that was a scenario just looking at one particular job. So I could have potentially, adjusted my labor model filters to bring that in, but to keep it simple and not affect my other configurations, I'm actually going to source the results directly. So I have the same sourcing opportunity for inputs as well as for results. So I'm just going to go and pick this source all metrics template. And this I've configured to bring in the raw hours just for that one job for the full year from that picking analysis scenario. So now again, I can bring in those results and consolidate them in this top-down budget plus adjustments. Okay, so assuming we do this for a bit further, let's fast forward a few months, to when that tug of war between ops and finance, or I guess all-out battle, depending on where you are, is finished, and we're ready to finalize the budget, as you were asking about, Bob. So let's open up my final budget scenario, which incorporates all those adjustments. And you asked about how to lock it down or publish it. That's also through this status. So I can lock it down, which means I can still run the scenario and update it with maybe most recent trend, but I'm not going to change configurations. Or I can go ahead and publish it. And that means no other user, unless you're an admin, can unpublish or edit the scenario, can't even change the name. Basically the scenario is locked down. So with that, it's officially ready to go, and I can start sharing it with other systems. So the way to do that is through our export utility, and we have a number of different options for that. You can export by summary level metrics, those detailed level metrics by standard. You can go by day or by week. We'll probably go by week in most cases, and by global or local currency. And then we can pick all or select metrics that I want to provide, a downstream system or team. So maybe the key ones will be, sales, wage rate, maybe that's sales per hour, expense rate, total hours, total cost. That's probably the key summary metrics I need, or I could pick them all and set the locations and time frame, and away you go. So hopefully that gives you all a pretty good idea of the power of Planara focused, around our budget process. And I think with that, in the interest of time, I'll turn it back over to Bob and David to recap what we saw.
Awesome.
Thank
you
you,
so
Luke.
much.
Absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much. I think you've really hit on some important pieces there around the alignment of the process about how finance and operations can kind of work together on this now, and it takes away that sort of adversarial approach to this. Clearly, by doing that, you can then kind of accelerate the process, right? You can actually go through and have different scenarios that you can model, and you can look at the budget in different ways, which obviously drives a much better analysis of the data that you've got, ending up with, you know, a much better plan. And then there's the adaptability. You know, halfway through the year, you can kind of go back and reassess, and maybe there's inflation needs to be taken into account, or there's some different exchange rates. So I think you've done a really good job. Thank you so much for taking us through that and showing us how we can take that really difficult process of a budget and actually try to simplify it in a single system and a single way of working that kind of makes sense for the whole business.
Well, yeah, and I want to thank everybody for joining us today. I hope you learned a little bit more about Planara, but if you're interested in diving deeper and having a deep dive demo, something that's more tailored for you, you can scan that QR code. You'll get taken to a form. You can provide some basic contact info, and tell us a couple of times it would be good to get in touch, and we can go from there. Alternatively, feel free to reach out to any of us with questions or to dive in deeper on Planara. I've included our email addresses on the left side of the screen there. I again want to thank you for your time, and I hope that you're as excited about Planara and its ability to solve your labor budgeting problem as we are. So have a great day, everybody. Thank you very much.